Hello everyone and welcome to this panel session on correcting historical errors. I would like to start by acknowledging that I'm seated on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I would like to extend my respect to elders past and present. I would also like to extend a warm welcome to any First Nations peoples joining us from around the world. It is a truism to say that errors from the unintended to the fraudulent and the implication of errors in the evidence base that we draw upon and generate occupies a primary focus for meta-research communities as well as historians and STS scholars. So it's been a really great pleasure to pull this fantastic panel of speakers together, each of whom will give a brief talk on their own research, which speaks to the panel theme, which is correcting historical errors, before we will open up with plenty of time for discussion at the end. A reminder that this session is being recorded, so if you like, please use the chat function if you want to pop questions in as you go, or at the end of each of the talks, there will be an opportunity for you to unmute and ask your questions as well. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Buchanan, who is an honorary research fellow in my school as well, in the History and Philosophy of Science program at the University of Melbourne. He's the author of Playing with Fire, the controversial career of Hans Eysenck, which was published in 2010. And Rod will briefly discuss his historical research examining Hans Eysenck, who many of you probably know was once the most prominent psychologist of his generation. Over to you, Rod, and you should be able to share screen.
Okay, thank you, Fallon. Okay, wait a minute. There we go. I've not done this before, can you tell? Okay. Thank you. Well, yes, this is a case study. It's quite a long and complicated saga. I'm going to compress it to the point of almost incomprehensibility, perhaps, with a bit of a rant in the middle. Apologies if I go a little over time. It is a complicated story anyway. As a case study, it's framed by a couple of questions lurking in the background. What do we do about questionable historic research, and is there a statute of limitations? And how do we decide which research should be sanctioned? Does replication have any place in this process? So once upon a time in the olden days, by that I mean over 10 years ago, most scientific research was apparently reasonably reputable, except for a few notorious cases of fraud. In psychology, the Cyril Burt case was the teaching example, certainly once when I was a student in the 1980s. Burt's student, Hans Eysenck, was the most prominent psychologist of his generation, and now he's well on the way to being one of the most retracted. Now, a little bit of background history. I'm not assuming much here, so I'll just run you through the quick background. There were two main strands of research to the dodgy research that Ronald Grossalf and Eysenck initiated, and was promoted heavily by Hans Eysenck. There were two large-scale prospective studies linking personality to disease in Kravenka, Yugoslavia in the mid-60s and Heidelberg, Germany in the 70s. And various intervention studies were also apparently conducted aimed at chasing personality in order to achieve better health outcomes. Now, the long-term follow-up suggested personality was an overwhelming causal factor in disease, especially coronary heart disease and cancer. And the intervention studies suggested that modifying disease-prone personalities in healthy directions could have remarkable preventative and even curative effects for cancer and CHD. They found the Rosetta Stone, it seemed. There's Heidelberg, Germany. It's a beautiful town, right? Can you see my pointer there? That's where Grossarth Matasek's house is there. I spent 2 days there. Very interesting. Now, this was never a detection problem or a sanctioning problem. The highly questionable status of this research was always pretty obvious. Many problems were noted at the time. It was presented in the 80s and 90s, and these included consistently stupendous effect size, orders of magnitude above other similar studies of personality and disease. But it wasn't entirely obvious to everyone at the time. Given the way they presented these results in rather crude fashion, they used chi-square of their metric of significance. They didn't use survival analysis. There was no OR and RR, a Cox regression, etc., or a Kaplan-Meier curve insight in any of their publications. And there was a total lack of control over this research program. No independent, secure registration of personality data, and virtually no other control either. And almost everything about this apparently massive research project was logistically unlikely and did not happen as described. And this research was really dangerous if taken seriously. In some ways, it was an easy case. It ticked all the boxes of egregiousness. So it got plenty of critical attention at the time, and there are 3 critical moments. But Eysenck stared down the criticism, as he's doing right there in that, you can see that on YouTube, and threatened legal action if fraud was ever mentioned. So it all came to naught. I mean, he was a towering figure and he just was able to tough it out. And the controversy died away. They stopped publishing and promoting it. After 1996, Eysenck's health deteriorated and he died in 1997. And so nothing happened really, as was typical of the period really. In the meantime, I did a biography of Eysenck, which appeared in 2010. Got reasonable reviews, but none highlighted what I thought was the revelatory chapter, the chapter on this research. It had a muted impact. It had been heavily redacted by OUP lawyers fearing libel action. Went through several iterations. Here's one. All those crossings out. Can I say it like this? What about this? Is that okay? Yeah, it was very frustrating. But timing is everything in history and comedy. And about 2012, everyone agrees, everything began to change. In 2015, Tony Pelosi was invited to contribute to a special issue of Personality and Individual Differences, and his article, very critical article, was rejected as potentially libelous, or so they say anyway. But it was finally picked up by David Marks at the Journal of Health Psychology in 2019. And Marks backed Pelosi up by calling for a formal investigation. And King's College, to their credit, convened an immediate inquiry and declared 26 of the joint publications, that is Eysenck and Grossarth Matasek's joint publications, as unsafe. Unfortunately, they only assessed a subset of Marks' list for review, which was actually a significant underestimate. He had about 60. And as I pointed out. So King's College London is now conducting a second inquiry to include many of the Eysenck publications, because I know them. As well, the BPS has just convened a new review to look into their old review. So far, there's been at least 21 retractions and 71 expressions of concern across 92 publications. But overall, the response has been pretty uneven, which is not atypical, really, I guess. Resistant for some journals, overzealous in others. For example, as well as retracting the key offending articles, Sage flagged just about everything else Eysenck published in their journals. Bit of an overreaction, perhaps. On the other hand, Paid was one of the holdouts. Here comes the rant. They elected to flag 3 articles with expressions of concern rather than retract them. And there's a bit of a conflict of interest here. Paid is probably the central journal for Eysenck-inspired psychology. And the people on that editorial board, well, they worked with Eysenck, knew Eysenck, had been mentored by him, and at least one of them had was an author on one of the articles in line for retraction. So they came out with a very high bar for retraction, which is, they claimed it was reserved for articles with which there was a clear evidence of purposeful malpractice or data fabrication, or an omission from the authors. And they claimed that hadn't been proven in this case. Well, you'll see. I mean, it was as though they just couldn't bring themselves to believe Eysenck knowingly participated in massive fraud, that he somehow didn't know what he was doing. But anyway, if a publication is seriously misleading and likely fraudulent, it should not matter what's going through authors' heads at the time. We don't have to be psychobiographers. So the paid board tacitly bolstered their stance with 2 articles that appeared just as this decision was published. Those 2 articles there. The first one from Anderson et al. Had an element of special pleading to it, with their network analysis showing that this research collaboration sits apart and you can't consider it to poison the well of Eysenck's enormous contribution. Yet they also showed in their network analysis that it was the most significant collaboration of Eysenck's career, save for that with his wife Sybil, underlying its centrality to his legacy, one would think. And the second article, which I'm going to target, was touted as an independent test of the validity of the Grossart, Mathesek and Eysenck personality stress model. Yeah, something of a replication, even maybe a vindication. Well, we'll see about that. This gets a bit complicated here, but Grossart and Mathesek had plenty of questionnaires. One of the first was a 4-type questionnaire. There are 3 main types to keep in mind: type 1, cancer prone; type 2, CHD prone; and type 4, autonomous healthy. The initial 4-type questionnaire was embarrassingly naive. It was first published in English only and paid in 1988, one of the articles they declined to retract. Yet they achieved spectacular results with some of the most extreme results published in paid in that 1998 article. Here's an item from that 4-type inventory. Look at that item. It's got 3 parts to it, or 2 or 3 parts to it. It's inherently unreliable, laughable, really. You couldn't get to a psychometric first base with items like that. Yet somehow they found the mother stone that you could magically predict from personality, by people doing these personality inventories, just what sort of diseases they're going to get and when they're going to die. Embarrassed perhaps by these longer type questionnaires, they later unveiled a short form, the Short Interpersonal Reactions Inventory, SIRI. This was an idiomatically translated instrument, they covered themselves there, but a reasonably respectable psychometric device. It had punchy, short, concise items like this. So, a little bit more plausible perhaps. Only 2 publications used the SIRI, and they were seemingly designed to insulate it against a growing chorus of criticism. People started using those old questionnaires and finding that they were hopeless. And what they did with these 2 SIRI articles is demonstrate that test administration made all the difference. You had to have explanation plus trust in an atmosphere of good breeding or something like that. And this was crucial for achieving the astonishing disease-prone associations. In their more comprehensive 1995 study, predictive success declined dramatically if only one of these factors was present, and actually reversed with basic self-administration, standard self-administration. That is, those classified as type 1 or 2 tend to be less likely to develop cancer or CHD when tested this way. They were in effect seemingly instructing, tutoring people on how to respond to particular item content, or so it seemed. The smaller and shorter 1993 study showed a less extreme version of this administrative effect, with associations declining as the administration got a bit more basic, but not quite reversing. Both of those were retracted. as they should be, dodgy as anything. Anyway, what did Whitfield et al. Do? They used a cut-down version of the series, scored it differently, and used an ultra-basic administration mode of mail-out. And they found type 1 scale was not associated with cancer mortality, and the type 2 scale was rather very weakly associated with CHD mortality. And the type 4 scale was associated a bit more strongly with better all-cause health outcomes. Oddly, rather than comparing their results with the two series studies, they compared with their modest, patchy associations with extreme data gathered from the 4-type questionnaire presented in that unretracted 1998 paid article. And helpfully, they gave an idea of the astonishing effect sizes by calculating odds ratios for the 1998 data. Take a look at that. Just feast your eyes on that. These are the odds ratios calculated for type 1 versus type 4, or type 2 versus type 4. Your risk, or odds risk. I mean, who doesn't like an odds ratio of 56 or a p-value of 10 to the minus 85? I mean, why aren't they embarrassed by using that as the yardstick? Goodness gracious. In any case, this is not the appropriate comparison. The Syrian and the 4-type questionnaires were actually quite different instruments psychometrically, and conceptually. I looked at the item content closely, and it doesn't quite match up. They should not be comparing their results to the series. They should be comparing the results to the series studies, but of course they're both now retracted. But if they did so, and if you took that study seriously, especially the more definitive 1995 study, their data is not a replication, possibly a refutation. Yet they claim their results were consistent with the two previous series studies. This I found a risible claim, a flat-out lie, frankly. So I was rather miffed by that. And in this case, far from being a self-correcting mechanism, replication was being used to prop up fraudulent research with an undeserved and misleading sense of legitimacy. It seemed particularly useless and inappropriate in this case when the target effect was so ambiguous anyway. And generally, it seemed to me that replication is a relatively blunt instrument as far as adjudicating fraud goes. Some thoughts. Legitimate research, of course, may fail to replicate. More worryingly, cleverly plausible fraudulent research may replicate, but would say very little about the legitimacy of the original research. And it seems here Eysenck was able to contrive, really by a bit of post-hoc reconstruction and hiding behind a kind of loose translation process, concoct a half-decent questionnaire out of the wreckage of those type inventories with a moderate capacity to identify personality correlates, not necessarily causal factors, of ill health. The resemblance of the series to whatever was originally done in the Heidelberg studies back in the 1970s is a highly questionable issue, however. To defend the integrity of this research, I mean, they're making a category mistake in a way, I think. To defend the integrity of this research, one would have to mount a very different kind of argument, do a different kind of investigation, defend it in a different way. So for my money, and I'm not a policy person, but for my money, if research is still in play, i.e. directly inspiring or impacting current research, it should be actionable. Practical limits, of course, to this. And this particular research plays into some seductive but damaging mind over body narratives. And it has been heavily cited in the past. And it has been used and is still used in much cited meta-analysis, and has a life of its own in the complementary alternative medicine literature. It was cited in this highly cited meta-analysis, 600 citations last time I looked. And it really makes a difference because the ORs are so large. If you include it in a meta-analysis, it really distorts findings. It's crucial in lifting them up to significance in some cases here. And it is still the subject of PhDs as late as 2018. So it makes it totally fair game. I mean, this breaks my heart. I saw this PhD on the Syrian. I thought, oh no, please, please don't waste your time. You just made it up. Anyway.
Rod, I think we might wrap up there.
Okay.
Yeah. If you want to just
quickly summarise. This has hardly been an efficient or expedient process. It's really hard to undo. But a few thoughts. The KCL inquiry was somewhat opaque, a bit distant. It took submissions, but it was less forensic than most of the published literature. They're hardly in a better position there than the experts and the long-standing critics. They did take into account personality disease literature as a whole, but trod lightly in the issue of direct replication. But as such, this inquiry only effectively collated a negative verdict already hiding in plain sight. But it changed the game because it had a weighty institutional imprimatur, similarly independent, authoritative and impersonal assessment, which prompted journalists to act, which carries their own weight, even though they acted somewhat inconsistently on equally dodgy publication. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Rod, and hopefully that has given you a flavour for his research and will prompt lots of questions during discussion. I'm sorry to have cut it short. It was fascinating to listen to. But I will, while Rod stops sharing, and Julia, if you've got slides, bring them up. Our next speaker is Julia Roja. Julia is a personality psychologist whose substantive research covers a broad range of topics. And today, Julia will be talking to us about the Loss of Confidence project, in which she and her collaborators invited psychologists to share situations in which they had lost confidence in their own work. Over to you, Julia.
Thank you. Thank you for the kind introduction. I hope you can see my right screen like this, just the slides. Perfect. Okay. So yeah, first of all, thanks for having me on this panel. So I'm going to say upfront, I think what Rod just told is like probably the more exciting like historical errors, and I would have loved to hear more, but it's limited space and time here. So let's move like into more recent history and talk about the Loss of Confidence project. So I'm going to start with the canonical quote concerning the self-correction of science, at least I think among scientists, and that is by Max Planck. So a new scientific truth does not generally triumph by persuading its opponents and getting them to admit their errors, but rather by its opponents gradually dying out and giving way to a new generation that is raised on it. And so you probably don't know this version of the quote. I assume you know the catchier version, and that goes, science advances one funeral at a time. I think this is the one that everybody knows. And I guess in some sense, you just had an example of that mindset in that talk about Hans Eysenck, right? So scientists will be incredibly stubborn. They will defend themselves against criticism. They will not admit any sort of wrongdoing. And so science can only advance once they are gone or they are replaced with somebody else. And so the question we wanted to raise is, does it need to be that way? Aren't there other ways to have progress in science and self-correction and so on? And so the historical context for this project was one particular set of studies, and that was about the issue of power posing. So just for those of you who don't know that controversy, but also those effects. So the claim behind power posing is that if you take on an expansive posture, that increases your risk-taking and your dominance in particular in women. So this might be helpful for them to lean in. And the original study on this was published in a prestigious outlet, and it led to an extremely popular TED Talk by Amy Cuddy, which I think is still like the second most viewed TED Talk. They are so highly influential. But this study was followed by multiple empirical failures to replicate it. So others just couldn't find the effect. And so this led to a lot of criticism, in particular targeted at Amy Cuddy. And this also resulted in a backlash, including an article in the New York Times magazine in which it sounded a bit like this whole affair was mostly about bullying. So there were critics trying to tear down a successful woman, and it went back and forth and back and forth. But actually, I don't want to talk more about Amy Cuddy here, because this is about self-correction. And if you look closely at the original PowerPost paper, it is not Cuddy et al. The first author was actually somebody else, Dana Carney. So what happened with Dana Carney? So she actually just stopped researching the topic and went on and did other research. And in 2016, she quietly dropped a PDF on her faculty website. So it looks like this. It's titled "My Position on Power Poses. Reasonable people whom I respect may disagree. However, since early 2015, the evidence has been mounting, suggesting there is unlikely an embodied effect of nonverbal expansiveness, i.e. power poses, on internal or psychological outcomes." So she just states, "I do not believe that these effects are real," even though she is the first author of the seminal paper on it. And she actually goes into more detail and describes how they analyzed the study from that original data. So they kind of like tried different things until they found something publishable. And what she describes in there would nowadays be described as p-hacking. So it's just like certain analytic strategies which very easily generate false positives findings. And so she said, because of that, I no longer believe in this. And so she actually just dropped that PDF because students kept contacting her, wanting to do research on that together with her. And she always had to explain, "Oh, sorry, I'm no longer doing this. And here's why I'm no longer doing it." So she just dropped that PDF, and it was found by some social psychologists who highlighted it in a Facebook group. And generally everybody just agreed that this was outstanding. So there's like very open treatment of her own past work, even like revealing some details that make it like kind of look bad, but the way she dealt with it was just generally, yeah, everybody was just very happy about this happening. But people also thought at this point, well, actually, maybe I would like to do such a statement as well. And wouldn't it be great if a lot of people actually did that and talked about p-hacking and so on? And couldn't that like lead to some change? And that led to the idea of the loss of confidence project. So it very much resulted from this whole PowerPost story, but the purpose was just like encouraging this type of behavior that Dana Carney showed when she dropped that statement. And so we started a website and invited psychologists to describe their loss of confidences in their own research. And we had a certain set of rules. And there was the author had lost confidence in the primary or central findings. So nothing like, oh, that like small additional analysis that wasn't valid, but really like the central finding. And the loss of confidence needed to have occurred because of theoretical or methodological problems. So not because new data came in and they simply rationally updated, but because they noticed that something was wrong. And the submitters needed to be willing to take primary responsibility and put the name on it. And so when we launched that website, the initial public reaction was extremely positive. So there were a lot of people that were like, "Oh yeah, that's super cool. I'm going to submit something here." But then when we actually waited for submissions, they came in very, very slowly. And so we had to publish a preprint, including the first statements, and invite more submissions and so on, just to show people, look, there's actually already like 5 people here. Maybe you want to join. It's not going to be embarrassing. And so on. And just to give you an idea of what these submissions looked like, I brought you an example statement of Talia Coney, who also initialized the project. And so the statements all kind of look the same, so they're like kind of anti-abstract. So they start with a brief description of the original research. For example, Talia Coney was correlating brain data with personality. And then he goes into the problems of the original study. So I now think most of the conclusions drawn in this article were absurd on their face. My understanding of statistics has improved a bit since writing the article, and it is now abundantly clear to me that A, I p-hack to a considerable degree, and that B, because of the winner's curse, statistically significant effect sizes from underpowered studies cannot be taken at face value. So he's essentially looking down very harshly at his own past work. And the other statements look a bit differently, so you can take a look at the paper if you want to. The statements are in there. So all in all, we received 13 loss of confidence statements, and they did come from a broad variety of psychological fields. So we got everything in the mix, like neuropsychology, social psychology, evolutionary research, experimental and personality work, and so on. And in these statements, there were a broad variety of issues that led people to lose confidence. But I think the one thing that stood out was p-hacking. So there were a lot of people just describing p-hacking, and then maybe also other problems, but p-hacking was quite like the dominant theme in there. And so we only got 13 statements, and depending on how one looks at that, that might be a lot or that might be very few. And so what we thought at this point was maybe it was just like too much of an effort to submit there. Like you need to write that thing, you need to put your name on it, you need to be willing to be involved with that paper and so on. So we thought, okay, let's follow up with an anonymous online survey just to eyeball the overall scope of the problem. So we just wanted to get a very rough guess. How often does something like this happen? How often do researchers lose confidence in their own work? So we did a non-representative online survey, so you cannot simply generalize the numbers I'm going to bring up soon. And it was open to researchers from all fields. So we just kept it very open and asked people to indicate their research fields. Most of them actually, 43% actually did not tell us which field of work they were in. But of those who did, most were psychologists or from business school, economics, and medicine. And overall, we ended up with a sample of just over 300 people. Most of them reported being from Europe or the US. And so first we asked people whether they had ever lost confidence in one of their own published research articles. And there was a bit of a mix. So most people said yes, but there was also a substantial number of people who were kind of unsure. So they were like, it's possible that I no longer believe in this. I'm actually not quite sure at this point. So we also asked them why they had lost confidence. And again, we had that broad variety of reasons, but again, the most frequent answer was questionable research practices. So everything related to p-hacking and so on. But we gave people the possibility to elaborate a bit. And so if, for example, one person wrote, I was a junior co-author who collected and cleaned data, and I felt some of the results were hacked or hacked, but did not do very much about it. So they noticed that something was off, but they didn't say anything. Or I think there was a mistake in the analysis script that I didn't double check because the results were in the direction of our hypotheses. So that is already some meta reflection. There's probably something off there, but I didn't double check, and that was probably self-serving. So for our loss of confidence project, it was like necessary that people believed that the loss of confidence was due to a mistake or shortcoming in judgment on the part of the researcher. So again, we asked people whether this applied to the one time they had lost confidence. And here, actually, the majority of people said, yes, this was due to a mistake or shortcoming in judgment. But for the loss of confidence project, we had also said, okay, people need to take personal responsibility. And now was that the case in our survey? And here we get a bit of a mixed picture. So 39 people said, yes, I take primary responsibility. But then there's actually also a large chunk of people that said that they take little or no responsibility. And I do believe that has to do with the demographics. So we did have a lot of graduate students filling out that questionnaire. And I think for them, it's quite reasonable to say, okay, a mistake happened here, but I take little or no responsibility because I was not the principal investigator. So of course, what matters for self-correction is kind of like whether that loss of confidence is somehow documented publicly. So we asked them whether that was the case for the time they had lost confidence. And here the overwhelming answer was no. So there was no sort of public documentation of the fact that they no longer believed their own finding. Of those who said yes, most refer to like statements in later publications or blog posts or conference presentations. So not the types of information that are easily accessed by other researchers, but more like hidden away. And of those who said yes, only 3 reported a formal correction or retraction of the article. So most of like the self-correction was kind of indirectly taking place elsewhere in the literature. And again, we asked people to tell us why they did not go public. And the answers were kind of all over the place. So a lot of people were actually not sure whether self-correction was warranted, but many also felt like it wasn't necessary, or they were concerned about the co-authors. They didn't know what to do next about it. And they were worried about the perception of such a self-correction, of course. So for example, one person wrote, I haven't had time to try and redo the analysis that I know are wrong. So I think this is actually quite a common occurrence. But also somebody plainly stating it would hurt my career plans, or maybe like there are a few more heartbreaking stories in there as well. I need published papers to get my PhD. Supervisor basically pressured to apply QOPs for publication. Otherwise, story wouldn't be sexy enough. Honestly, I stopped to care. All in all, I'll leave science anyway. So when you actually look at the text answers, you can see that there are like some just individual stories in there that are quite heartbreaking. So wrapping it up at this point, what can we learn from this project? So I think we clearly see just from the reaction that people had to the project, of course we do have that prescriptive norm. Self-correction is a good thing. And people who actually self-correct their own mistakes, they are lauded publicly. But there's also the descriptive norm that many have lost confidence in one of their own findings, and they never do anything about that publicly. And I don't think there's an easy answer to why that is the case. There's obviously a host of reasons that keeps researchers from correcting their own claims. So that does include concerns about reputation and careers, but maybe also less selfishly, I mean, it also involves concerns about co-authors or doctoral students whose title might depend on a particular line of work. And last but not least, there's also a large number of people who say that the information is just not important. Nobody would care if I corrected a paper I published. And on the pragmatic side, there is a lack of protocol for how to deal with these situations. Like, what do you do if you publish something, there's something wrong with it? Do you retract it? Do you move on in some different way? What is your value for self-correction? And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention. And I'm not sure whether we will have some time for questions now or later.
We'll do questions later altogether at the end. So yeah, I will hand over to Riana while I introduce Riana Minocher, who is a PhD student. Riana's dissertation aimed to quantify the reproducibility of research literature, in particular research published on the topic of social learning, and she is currently working on addressing questions about the role of authors, collaboration networks, and institutions in facilitating reproducibility within the literature. Riana, you should be able to share screen if you have slides.
I hope you can see my screen and also just the slides. Yeah. Okay, so yeah, I'm Riana, and I will be talking about whether and how we can share, or we should correct the historical scientific record. And I'm going to try to give some examples from the field of evolutionary anthropology, like Fallon mentioned, including my own work, but also the work of some of my collaborators. So I just want to signpost my talk quickly because I'm talking about a bunch of different things. I'm first going to talk about this reproducibility project that I worked on, which gives some context as to why I'm here. Then I'm going to go over an example of a high-profile correction that occurred recently in our field. And then I want to share some thoughts on the current scientific incentive structure. And then I'm going to discuss what I think some of the issues are specifically for early career researchers in the current system. So I also presented this project at the session on challenges to computational reproducibility in this conference. So I apologize if some of it is repetition. But essentially, I conducted a study on the reproducibility of work in evolutionary anthropology, in which we tried to estimate the rate of reproducibility of the social learning literature. And what we did is to survey 560 empirical quantitative publications relevant to this research topic, social learning. And this ended up being kind of a diverse sample with journals and authors from a range of traditional disciplines like psychology or animal behavior. And for the project, we defined reproducibility as a series of conditional states necessary to reproduce findings. So we assumed it depends on data availability, data usability, analytical clarity, and finally, the agreement of reproduced results with published findings. So what we found overall is kind of a shockingly low rate, or maybe not that shockingly, low rate of data availability, in that we were able to recover data for just about 30% of the original sample. And of this, about a third of the data was actually available to download online, but the remaining data we received through direct data requests. And we also essentially found that no data was available for studies more than 20 years old. So in terms of reproducibility of results, conditional on recovering data, our results were a bit more encouraging. So we found we were actually able to recreate the evidence listed in publications using the materials provided in the vast majority of cases. And by this, I mean we obtained results that were coherent with the original claims in about 96% of cases when we had already considered data understandable and analyses understandable. But overall, and largely because of the lack of extant data, we estimated a low rate of reproducibility for the sample, about 23%. So the goal of this study was simply to assess what proportion of the literature we might consider reproducible. And what we didn't do is to assess the scientific quality of the work. So in fact, what I actually learned in practice is that achieving reproducibility doesn't really imply anything about the quality of scientific research necessarily. And actually in a number of my reproduction attempts, I found myself thinking researchers made analysis choices that I wouldn't have and constructed a design to test a hypothesis in a way that I also wouldn't have. But what became really clear to me is that reproducibility is in fact a minimum criterion to begin to think about these types of corrections. So I could only confidently critique a particular analysis if I'm first able to reproduce it, because otherwise I can't really be sure that the analysis I'm criticizing is even the analysis that the researcher performed in the first place. So at the outset, I would say it's impossible to think about correcting the record if we don't have original data and sufficient analysis details to first reproduce old findings. But I want to quickly go over an example of a relatively recent high-profile correction in our field that highlights how reproducibility is necessary to facilitate corrections, but also points out what some of the issues with the way in which this ends up happening currently might be. So in 2019, a paper was published in Nature that showed using a large historical database that the belief in moralizing supernatural agents or gods evolved to facilitate cooperation between large groups of unrelated strangers. So the authors constructed and used this big historical database to show first a clear association between social complexity and the presence of moralizing gods, and next that the appearance of these gods came after the formation of large-scale societies. So it was really great, and to the author's credit, that the data and code to reproduce the results of this paper were published online alongside the paper, and so it could be verified that the results could be recreated using the methods described and the code provided. But when reproducing the analyses, other researchers in our community noticed a kind of problematic analytical assumption had been made. So specifically, they noticed about 2/3 of the original data were actually on the presence or absence of these gods was actually missing. And so the original authors had made the assumption that when it was unknown whether moralizing gods were present or absent, that they were simply absent. And so effectively, they turned all of the NA values in the data into zeros. And here, so this is, in general, just one kind of imputation technique, but in this case, it's not very defensible. So first, it's kind of a flaw to consider the absence of evidence as the evidence of absence. Second, it's a really large proportion of the data. And when the data was reanalyzed without this assumption, it was found that the presence of these moralizing gods actually precedes the increase in social complexity. So it reversed the relationship reported in the original publication and suggested that this result was an artifact of the analysis assumption. So this whole process led to a Matters Arising publication, which showed the treatment of missing data determined the conclusions and led to a retraction of the original article. But like I mentioned at the start, what is really important to note about the whole situation is that the authors of the original publication had made all of the data and code available, and this correction was only possible because of this. But the whole ordeal was kind of traumatic, both for the authors, the original authors, and also for the rest of us watching it happen. And in part, this was because the paper was published in Nature and it received a lot of attention on Twitter and other social media. Oops. So I think finding this flashy result in a high impact journal had to be retracted may not really be that surprising. It's a well-known fact that more boring and uncontroversial research topics seem to be more scientifically rigorous. And this phenomenon is actually known as Bergson's paradox, or the selection distortion effect. So what happens is that all that's necessary to produce a negative correlation between so-called trustworthiness of research and newsworthiness of research is that journals or institutions need to just care about both of these things. And so as long as they pick the most newsworthy and the most trustworthy research, there ends up being a sample of work in which the correlation between these things is negative, even if there's no true causal relationship between them. And so as a consequence, flashy results receive more attention, they're cited more. Does it mean that they're on average less rigorous? Maybe. And does it also mean that they receive more criticism and attention? Also, maybe. And in fact, previous work has shown that the rate of retraction is correlated with journal impact factor, which could suggest both of these things. So then the question becomes, also like Julia talked about in the last presentation, who's actually responsible for these kinds of corrections or retractions? In the moralizing gods example, should the problematic assumption have been found out during the review process before the article was accepted and widely shared? Or do we expect to leave these kinds of corrections up to the scientific community? And then if we do leave it to the community, as it seems to happen, what does it mean for some researchers? And I think one really relevant concern is that the burden of correction seems to disproportionately affect early career researchers. So again, as we just heard from people's experiences in the loss of confidence project, on big collaborative projects, the senior author doesn't often do the analysis, and the analysis is done by a junior author. And it's also known that early career researchers more readily adopt reproducible norms and practices. And it ends up being kind of a struggle to convince more established collaborators of the importance of sharing data and code. And so when high profile corrections are made, like in this example I just went through, the person that did the analysis and shared the materials gets the lion's share of the criticism. And this isn't really fair to early career researchers who just have more to lose, both from work being corrected, but also from correcting others. And in relation to this point, I want to share some of the responses I got to the data requests I sent during my survey. So somebody wrote to me, there is no code, scripting, or paper data still in existence. This does not mean that the results are in any way invalid. I do not agree with the focus of your project. And somebody else wrote, looking at studies done even just a few years ago, i.e. published 2015 or earlier, is completely counterproductive. And then this is usually everyone's favorite. I don't see the point here, really. So of course, I had a lot of anxiety when I was conducting these reproduction efforts. I didn't collaborate with authors to reproduce analyses, and I didn't contact anyone when I failed to reproduce results. And this was part of our protocol. So, you know, in some ways, I would consider papers for which I was actually able to attempt a reproduction more reproducible than papers that didn't even have any extant data. And I didn't want to punish researchers for providing data rather than not at all. But in part, it was also a constraint I put on the project going in. So I wasn't interested in uncovering gross errors in the literature at the time. And I kind of felt it wasn't going to be beneficial for me as an exercise or do me any favors as a scientist. So I didn't happen to find any examples of gross misconduct, but I also didn't evaluate the quality of the research that I surveyed. I was focused on reproducibility. So, you know, I feel like the natural question is, what does it all mean for the role of reproducibility in correcting the record? So something I did notice through this reproducibility project is that even if these norms are enforced better, the current scientific incentive structure might mean there's no change in the actual quality or correctness of findings. So for one, it's really easy to develop defensive practices, intentionally or unintentionally, and consider that we found 13% of data could not even be used when it was available. And other studies have found even lower rates of data usability when it's in principle available. So researchers can easily make their studies appear reproducible just by providing some material. And this material can hide a lot of information about how the sausage is really made. So just a few examples are things like broken links or partial data or badly documented code. And while, you know, we can have a discussion about whether or not this is questionable in terms of a research practice, the point is that enforcing reproducibility might not even have the intended consequence of improving it. And I also want to point out that previous work has shown that the current scientific incentive structure can actually select for bad research practices without any bad intentions from the part of researchers. So it just arises as a consequence of rewarding research volume, novelty of research, and positive findings over rewarding high effort and a slower model of research. So to sum up, I think scientific progress is the accumulation of very small increments of knowledge, and it's, you know, somehow Darwinian in process, so that it doesn't really proceed in leaps and bounds. And so we shouldn't be looking for and rewarding novelty. But at the same time, of course, we should expect a certain rate of false discovery because it's bound to happen. And reproducibility definitely facilitates the detection of errors in the record. But it's in no way a complete solution, and at least in my survey sample, most data for old publications is not even extant any longer, so we have no hope of correcting a large proportion of the literature in this way. And looking forward, I guess I would suggest that we need to think more deeply about how the current environment affects the ways in which things like reproducibility, replication, robustness can actually be effective in the dynamics of self-correction. So with that, I will end this talk, and thank you to all of the authors that participated in the study that I mentioned I conducted, and to all my co-authors and research team, and thank you for listening.
All right. Well, that concludes, I guess, an insight into 3 very different pieces of research that covers the evidence base from about 1955 to the present. So while everyone gathers your thoughts and gets your questions ready, and I think you will all have the ability to unmute yourselves and ask questions of the panel yourself, I thought it might be productive to kick off by sort of asking a really broad question of the 3 of you, Rod, Julia, and Riana, which is a very open and broad one, which is, in your view, what do we do about questionable historic research, and how much energy should we invest into correcting past research? And maybe we can go in reverse speaking order. So Riana first, or Rod first, I don't mind. Whoever's brave enough to start.
Yeah, I mean, I can start.
Absolutely.
So I think, yeah, I mean, I think one thing that I'm still stuck on is that there's just no way to invest, even if we have unlimited time and resources. There's no way to correct a lot of the historical record, because the original data, at least what I found, is the original data simply doesn't exist for such a large proportion of these studies. So, you know, just unless we could go back in time and save some of this original data, it just seems like it's not possible. So yeah, I think diverting our efforts to thinking about how we can correct the future of science may be more worthwhile.
Rod, Julia, thoughts?
Rod, do you want to go first, or shall I?
Oh, I'm not sort of a policy person, as I said, but there is kind of a distinction between bad research and fraudulent research. You know, things that might be wrong but was carried out in good faith, versus things that, well, cheating, making stuff up, and I see a distinction there, and where we've got good reason, like in my case, to investigate and do something about stuff we have good reason to correct or take out of the literature because it's misleading and likely fraudulent, then we should do it. And there should be systematic ways, systematic protocols for doing so, I guess. But as for things that we now believe are wrong, or things that things were carried out in good faith that just doesn't stand up, I think there are practical limitations to interrogating that, and people will move on from it, I guess. Carrying out their own research conceptually, or take it in another direction and just simply leave that behind. Kind of the evolutionary processes, was saying.
So yeah, maybe if I add something. So I think it's good, to make that distinction, right, between bad and fraudulent research. But if we have the distinction, there's still the question, right? Like, for example, when it comes to bad research, like how much of that do we clean up? And how much do we just let like disappear in, just forget about it? And so I think they're like the two extreme viewpoints. The one is like that every mistake in a published paper and so needs to be addressed at some point. And I think we quickly see like we just don't have the resources to do that. So if I do a literature search on so I'm doing personality research. So I look at all these old studies and it's a huge mess. And it's just like, okay, I can't engage with all of that. If I did, I would never be able to do any productive research. I would just sit there and have a career criticizing everything that were published. But I think there's also like the other extreme viewpoint. So some people are now like, oh, why do you keep like criticizing research? It's all about doing better work in the future. So I want to focus on enabling others to do better research. And of course, there's some merit on it, and we definitely need to ensure that there are better research practices in the future. But then, I mean, like, we as scientists are building on the published literature. So clearly, we can't just ignore mistakes in the recent past. So I do believe the optimum must exist somewhere in between. And currently, I do feel like we are currently not investing enough effort into cleaning up. And it actually, to me, it shows whenever I try to write a substantive research article and try to write an introduction, and there's so much mess in the literature, and I can't not engage with it because I'm writing an introduction section. So I often get like diverted and need to start like writing a methods paper instead to explain these things. And so I do think right now we need to clean a bit more up to be able to progress and do better research. So I think right now we're erring too much on not cleaning up. But of course, I don't think it's sensible. So a lot of people in the loss of confidence project were also like my work got cited 0 times. I think nobody ever read that. And then I at this point, I kind of would agree, right? Okay, it's not your first priority to fix that one mistake in that paper that unfortunately nobody is reading anyway. So yeah, I guess it's somewhere in the middle, but I don't know where the right point is.
There's a question in chat, and I think maybe Jennifer has a question as well. We'll start with a question on chat and then move to Jennifer. Eden Smith says, that's all really interesting, and I agree. I'm curious to hear more about how your focus on historical practices might inform how we delineate between different notions used to evaluate research, so reliability, replicability, reproducibility, etc., and how these might differ over time. Julia, Rod, Riana, happy for you to unmute yourselves.
I guess I can start again. So I guess I'll just share my own experience. So I went into my project on the reproducibility of literature and evolutionary anthropology, thinking replication doesn't, because I had heard a lot about the replication crisis in related fields, and I thought replication doesn't really have a role or such a role to play in anthropology as much as reproducibility does, because often we're not looking for the same thing in different contexts. We wouldn't expect the same kind of question. We wouldn't expect the same finding under different contexts. But more recently, I've come to realize that, so now I feel like reproducibility is kind of a given, but there should be a change in the value of replication in our field, because it's not about looking for the same kind of answer, but it's about asking the same question in slightly different ways in different populations. And then we still might learn a lot about the dynamics of a phenomenon. So it's not really the outcome, but it's more about the mechanisms that might have produced whatever outcome we're interested in. So I don't know if that's a little bit detailed, but that's just one of, you know, it's one of the things that I think these practices also change in meaning over time, and then change in the way that the research in the field is conducted. So, yeah.
Julia or Rod, do you have anything you'd like to add?
It's possible you could be a little bit, I don't know quite what Eden's asking there, but it's possible you could be a little bit more context specific or context sensitive about evaluating research in the past in terms of the criteria of what went at the time, what was regarded as good research practices. I mean, QRPs, you know, in the olden days were just RPs. And we can perhaps go a little bit easier on people for that reason. In terms of the way we evaluate, I'm not sure I have any more elaborate thoughts than that, though.
All right. Well, I'll move on. Jennifer, you can just unmute yourself and ask your question if you'd like.
Oh, thank you, Fallon. I think my question is sort of a combination of things that a couple of the speakers have talked about. I know, Riana, you made reference to the fact that there seems to be a correlation between journal impact factor and retractions. And that's something that, you know, I guess I've thought about. There's multiple ways of interpreting that, but one way could be that, well, firstly, journals of higher impact factor maybe have more of a reputation to protect. And secondly, they're possibly more functional journals because they may have more resources to bring to bear to investigating papers post-publication. So I'm wondering whether sort of one approach, I agree, you know, we can't correct all the literature that's there to correct, but maybe an approach that we're thinking about is trying to find journals that are likely to be willing partners that are actually going to engage in the process. So finding a willing partner and then trying to correct stuff in that journal because they're likely to do something. Our own experience in describing papers to journals is that the vast majority of journals just don't even respond. So you can waste a lot of time, I think, on this potentially and not actually not go any further. So that's just kind of an idea. Is it maybe better to target higher impact factor journals, firstly because their research gets more attention, but also more pragmatically because maybe the journals are more likely to do something about it.
So I don't know. So I do think it makes sense, right? One would start with high impact factors, also just to have like, you know, like send some signals and so on, see people, okay, this is now important because if it happens even if it happens in like personality and inter-individual differences, nobody kind of cares. And so I see the point. At the same time, I'm not willing whether high impact factor journals are more willing to do something. And I guess that's one general topic that we also discussed actually in the loss of confidence paper. So one could think that journals would care about the correction of things they published. It seems very, very mixed, up to the point that researchers who try to correct their own articles can't do so because the journals don't react or say, no, we don't do that. And so right now I do think, and so this leads to a broader problem that is scientific publishing, right? And it seems right now like the journals are not helping the process of self-correction. And so there are different ways to go forward about that, but I do think it's like an underlying problem with all of that, that one would hope journals would be investing resources into this. And I don't know of many great examples, unfortunately.
They're so variable, though, in their approaches. Different journals have very different policies. And the Sage Open were very proactive in the case of extremely so, and they were very eager to liaise with us and then like about which things should be retracted and flagged. But then there's other publishers, you know, publishers that start with E, who are a little bit more reluctant. And if you look at their guidelines, boy, they don't really want to do much about it. You know, they're very vague and yeah, publishers greatly vary, really, and I think they affect what journals, their particular stable of journals do, that editors too. There needs to be something more uniform about that. I think people have done work on this.
Pranali, you should now be able to unmute yourself and ask your question of the panelists.
Yes, yeah, hi. I had two questions. First was, I don't know how it is in like psychology and all some of these fields which are mentioned because I'm from neuroscience. But like from my personal experience, one of the strategies some people use to, not offend anybody and still correct the previous literature is use newer techniques. So at least in neuroscience, where now we have better techniques in terms of imaging or recording and so on, people just do the same, like test the same hypothesis, but with better techniques. And then instead of criticizing the methods of previous people, they just say that, we have better techniques and that's why, even if that was not the reason why previous paper was wrong. Like, they just do it so that, nobody's offended, but it's corrected. And I was given a similar advice to say that if you want to do your research correctly, but don't want to offend anybody, do that. Change your method a bit and just say it's that. In any case, I was wondering, like in, I didn't see many people here in like from hard sciences, but are there like methods which have changed now? And like maybe types of questionnaires, or I don't know what kind of methods are used, but if they are changed and they are better now, if instead of correcting previous research, you could, do this, and I don't know how feasible that is.
I think those are great points, and it's also like one of the points where you don't need to retract everything, right? If there's like a huge change in the methods in the field, and there's some consensus, this is how we do things now, this is how we used to do them, but then if you see a published paper that uses the old method, you're going to take it with a grain of salt, regardless of why it might be flawed, right? And I think that's one of the huge advantages if you have fields where you have some methodological consensus, where you can say, we now got better technology, we now do have better findings. And I think that is marvelous if that works. In psychology, I feel like we lack that, we often lack that consensus. So people will pitch new questionnaires, but it's never like, this is objectively better and everybody can agree that this is better. So we can't use these methods as stepping stones to kind of leave behind or say, okay, this is now the past research, we know it's an old method, now we got the new things. So in psychology, there's that weird thing where all things exist in parallel. And I wish we could get to a stage where we had that like broad agreement. This is how we do things now. We don't even need to pay close attention to things that were done in a different way. And I'm afraid we're not there yet, but I'm happy if other fields can move forward in that manner.
Riana, for anthropology, is there perhaps methodological consensus, or is it quite a plural discipline?
Yeah, I think there isn't. I would agree with Julia. There's not necessarily a methodological consensus, or the consensus that some methods or some tools are better than others. There's also a lot of kind of parochialism, or people are very protective about the tools that they design to collect data as well. And so, yeah, I don't think that we would necessarily accept, this is better, and so this result now invalidates any previous results that don't agree. But I will say something that I kind of saw when I was trying to reproduce studies in a sample. Often there was a model, like a huge inferential or a few inferential results in a paper that supported a claim, but usually people kind of amass a bunch of evidence to support a claim, and sometimes there's also evidence that's kind of descriptive, or that's just a bit more, that doesn't require this, at least in our field, it doesn't require this additional complicated method to show. And in that case, these results are still valid if we consider the simpler evidence to be justification of that result. So in some ways, I think making methods more sophisticated doesn't really solve the problem, actually.
Yeah. Rod, I'm not sure if you'd like to add anything to Pranali's question.
Okay, I had a second question, if it's okay.
Yeah, sure. And I
So
encourage everyone else to, in the meantime, either type out your questions or raise your hand.
So I wanted to ask, when you were asking for previous data, Riana, you mentioned some people did not get back, and like in general, so at least in neuroscience, when I looked at the laws of the journal, they generally mention that if data, you want data, you can contact the authors, and if they don't give, you can contact the editor. And like legally, it seems that they say that, if it's not available, they can retract it, or they will. Like, it's unclear, but they'll do something about it, at least in the laws. Is it the same in psychology? And has anybody tried to take like legal approach to wanting to have the data?
Yeah, actually, I'm not aware of whether I would be in my rights to. So for this study, I think that I was kind of interested before I went in whether it wasn't legal, but whether the journals had policies to mandate data, and whether this affected my ability to then access the data. But just because of the nature of what I ended up doing, I could still code that, but I haven't analyzed that yet. So I'm not sure, but I can say anecdotally, of course, people wrote in their papers, the data is available online at this repository and it wasn't, or the data is available on request, but they didn't respond to a request. But we had a really high rate of response to our data requests. And I think that's in part driven by the fact that I wrote a really detailed email. And also I wrote from an institution that is like relatively well known in the field. So maybe this also drove our response rate. So it wasn't just like a random early career researcher. I also had my supervisor, my PhD supervisor, and the head of our department sign the email. So this could have affected whether I got a response or not. But I think I would say actually I noticed the opposite, that people expressed people did express the concern that I'm not entitled to the data that they collected, which in some cases is true, because the data doesn't belong to them in some of these cases, and there are procedures in place. So yeah, in some ways maybe it's the opposite of my legal right to the data.
Well, I'm going to exercise my role as chair and ask a question, and maybe this is one for you, Riana, which is, should we distinguish between correction and retraction, and when are corrections justified or full retractions warranted?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm really interested in this question because I feel like the correction and retraction are kind of used interchangeably, or at least that is the case. But maybe the way, but I think that corrections should be natural. And I was interested in Rod's talk when he mentioned that retraction, the journal defined retraction is only necessary when there's clearly a fraudulent intention, or the research is fraudulent. And I think kind of reducing the costs of correcting the scientific record will make it a lot more, will just make it easier to correct, so that the costs of both the social reputational costs and also the costs of just contacting the journal and getting a response, if these go down, then, and we make corrections more normative, then it would be easier to update.
So maybe for the retraction / correction thing, right? So first of all, I think this is super field specific, because I know sometimes I talk to people from STEM and they're like, of course it should be retracted if it doesn't replicate, right? And in psychology, we're so far from the notion that you would retract a paper just because it fails to replicate, because that could happen by chance and so on. But in at least some parts of STEM, it's more like, well, if it's not correct, it's not correct. So put it away, right? And so first of all, it is very field specific. And so in our loss of confidence paper, we actually have some arguments in there so that we actually should not encourage retractions, because retractions are so high cost. So you lose a publication, you have that stigma associated with it. And maybe if you want to go forward that way, we need to have some different label for it. So maybe there's a retraction that is for the fraudulent cases. And then we have something like a voluntary withdrawal by authors who raise the issue themselves, because there is some evidence that these retractions do not hurt citations of those researchers and so on. So they are clearly different. Right, so there's that idea that we shouldn't have that punishment of a retraction, because then people will just like hide the mistakes because they're so afraid of that. I think there could also be a point be made that actually we should have that retraction and do uphold the standard that we want the literature to be as correct as possible. And of course, if something is retracted, it does not disappear completely, right? It still can be found, but it's clearly marked as no longer the state of the art, and you don't have to read and cite it and so on. So I'm really torn on that. I do think retractions are the established mechanism that we have to share corrective signals. And if we don't want to use them more widely, we need to come up with different signals. So maybe different labels for retractions and so on, but they need to be implemented the same way that retractions are implemented, that is clearly visible on the publisher website. And even maybe we need to have more, right? So there's some software right now that flags it as something in your library has been retracted. And I think that needs to become the norm, because if people just download PDFs, they will never find out if something changed. And that is definitely like a technological challenge, and also the question how we want to deal with those papers, whether we want a retraction or some other label to flag mistakes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Roger, you unmuted yourself. Yeah.
Yeah, yes, I agree with what you're saying, Julia. I mean, fraudulent research, I think, should always be retracted. If people have made serious and misleading mistakes, and particularly if they put their hand up for it, and the paper can't be corrected in the sense that it fundamentally undermines their conclusions and what they say, because you can offer corrections where they did this, that, and the other thing, but it doesn't fundamentally alter what they wrote in their paper. But if it does, then there's a problem. And maybe there has to be another kind of category where, particularly if they're willing to put their hand up, they can be offered a chance to correct and maybe correct and republish. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe that's a particular kind of option you could take. But serious mistakes should be corrected.
So actually that is, so we got one loss of confidence story in our paper where there was like a huge programming mistake that invalidated all the findings, and the journal actually went that way so that the article got replaced. So the paper was replaced with a completely new paper that had as the title, the opposite finding. So it was very clear and transparent. And that is one way to move forward that also kind of rewards the authors who came forward and brought up this super huge mistake. Yeah. So that might be a way forward for journals as well.
Yeah, and offers an incentive to being more upfront and transparent, perhaps.
We have two more questions. Felipe, I'm not sure if you want to unmute yourself and ask the question, or if the current discussion sort of covered some of what you were asking.
Yeah, hi, do you see me? Yeah. Yeah, well, I think it covers, I was just curious about what other mechanisms. I think Julia mentioned already that perhaps having these signals being shared via citation software and so on. So I'm just curious if there are more ideas of what other mechanisms can help with that, right? Because I think there is it seems to me that sometimes there are like two communities: people who kind of see what's happening in terms of replication, reproduction, and what's being corrected, and then like the wider community, I think, is often not paying attention to those discussions, right? So it's just, I don't know if you have any ideas of how to reach that wider community.
Tricky question. Who would like to start?
So, yeah, maybe just to say, I think this is one of the the big problems we are facing, like meta science problems, right? Like there are all these things happening now, but the information is not disseminated to the right people. But then at the same time, everybody is awash in information, right? And like you can't follow everything and you can't read everything. So I do think this is actually one of the great challenges I feel for science right now. Is like, how do we ensure that this information flows, even though there are so many people in science publishing so much? Like, how do you ensure that the community learns about a failure to replicate? And right now, I think we only do have the journals as a reliable mechanism to reach a community, or maybe also the associations, if they are involved in these things. So I know that some associations are quite involved in now transparency and so on, and they do have those mailing lists. But it is kind of astonishing that we still have like mailing lists and journals as the mechanisms to inform people about what is happening at the cutting edge. But we can't expect everyone to follow everything on Twitter either, right? So I think it's like one of the huge challenges, and I would be super happy if anybody had a solution for that.
Sorry, I have a suggestion if I don't know. So there is a website called 80,000 Hours, which has a list of the most pressing problems of our time. And it's a very, they have all the problems and then they have all the suggestions to take up that as a career. So anyway, the point is, I had actually written to them saying that reproducibility seems to be a major problem because all the suggestions you're giving to solve these other problems are based on research. And I mean, I don't know whether that research is valid or not anymore. Like, who can tell if you have not checked? So I don't know if I didn't get, I contacted one person, but at that point I did not have that much information. They recommended to me the book Bad Pharma, that you can look it up and maybe find more people. They did not know already people, but maybe like these organizations which have come up now in the last years, like UKRN and so on, could talk to them because they also funnel funding for these projects. So it's an initiative where they actually advise people that if you're not actually doing something for social impact, but you're, want to donate money, where is the best money you could give? And I don't know, it just seems like they have a network of way of, getting this idea to people who really want to make a change in the world on good problems. So I don't know, I thought I'd just add that.
Thanks, Pranali. I'm conscious of the time, so I think there's a question from Fiona, which I'm going to throw to you, Rod, to start with your historical lens on and your experiences in particular. And Fiona's question is, could something like loss of confidence help protect against future fraud, like being able to dig out of a hole before digging it deeper?
Yeah. Quite possibly. I actually feel like asking you, Julia. You talk about loss of confidence, and with the emphasis on loss, the question in my mind is: did they have some of these people have confidence in their findings in the beginning? And I really wonder about some of these things. People feel pressured to publish. Know things are problematic, probably don't have a lot of confidence in the beginning, but see if it flies at a journal, see if it gets published, and take it from there. And perhaps that could be a mechanism for a way of digging out of a hole before you dig it so deep you can't. Yeah, it's quite possible. So beyond that, I'm not sure I can add much, but you really wonder in some cases how cynical they were being when they were putting some of their ideas forward, just how realist their philosophy was, or were they simply playing it as a game and seeing how much they could get away with? And perhaps with a more stringent scrutiny process, people will be a little bit more careful about that. I'm not sure, but there is that loss of face element, which is something people don't want to admit to, and it sort of militates against people being honest about how they actually feel about their research.
So, Rod, you were absolutely right. So there were a few people also they were like, I'm not sure whether I had a loss of confidence. I never believed in that to begin with. We had quite a few of these. And so I do think there is a large number of people who are aware it's like the game character, and in particular, early career researchers who know that they are in that vulnerable position, right? And so you're playing along. And actually believe for those people, so first of all, like being able to have something like a loss of confidence statement, or also like a correction of their own work, would be like a way to get like a clear break, right? Because I do know people who are ashamed of what they've published in the past and just have like a clear breakline, and now you can start new, and maybe also get back at your advisor, pressured you into doing this. And then if you move on and have a new position elsewhere, you can be like, well, I no longer believe in that, and now I can like just severe ties here and so on. And I mean that in some sense that's what Dana Kane is when she just moved to a different literature, right? And I do think for early career researchers there could be a good way forward. I think the way we often like craft careers, at least in psychology, it's often people are associated with those particular things, right? So there is like the power pose lady, and then there is like the person that does this personality construct and that person, and that works against this idea that you could like make a clean break and move on to something else without digging deeper and deeper where you can't get out again. So yeah, I hope some people might use that as inspiration and be like, okay, I did some junk research. I'm actually going to write a critical paper on that and publish it maybe in Metapsychology or something, who publish such papers. And then I move on to something else. And I really would hope that it works like that. I don't know whether it really helps against the big fraudsters, because I think there's probably more intent and planning, but maybe for some like early career people, right, who are being like tugged into one direction by their advisors, but who might want to go a different way. And I think for them, it would be good to have like a formal mechanism, formal correction process and so on, to just have this breakup.
Sorry, I just saw Fiona's comment in chat. And I know from experience, every time someone says that they've downloaded my PhD, my first reaction is to shudder. And my second is to say, please don't tell me if you find anything wrong. I don't want to know. But I think it's fair to say that this is an open, interesting, multifaceted, cross-disciplinary question. And can I ask everyone to please use reactions, or unmute yourself, or show appreciation for our three panelists, and who have given us, I hope you agree, some really fascinating insights and a lot of food for thought. And with that, we're almost on time. So thank you again. And for those of you for whom it's evening, good evening. And for wherever you are in the world, thank you for joining us. I do believe there's another session after this. But yeah, thanks again.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. That was great. Rod, I want to hear like a 2-hour version of that talk sometime. Maybe on Friday.
I did get through it, by the way. I had nothing more. So, I wasn't cut off.
I'm sorry, Rod. I thought, I want to leave lots of time because people will have questions, which they clearly did.
Thanks, Riana. Julia. Julia's keynote, of course, tomorrow.
Oh, I should have mentioned.
5 p.m. our time. Whether that is in other places of the world.
It's 7 a.m. here.
Well, thank you.
It's no problem. My husband will have to get up earlier to watch our toddler.
Tell him thanks.
All right. Oh, Rani, I see your host.
I'm just, yes, I'm hosting. I'm just doing the permissions and handing over to Daniela, who is on the call right now. Where is she? I'm just going to hand over the host to her because they're using our link. That's why this workshop is fine. And now Daniela. Daniela, you are the host.
Oh, super, thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Hi, Christina.
Hey, good morning, afternoon.
Good morning. And you're co-hosting, that's brilliant. Let me set up the polls. You have the updated slides, right? I very quickly added this morning's stuff.
Yeah, I saw it. I do.
Okay. I cannot.
Do you want me to share the slides now, or do you want to do the poll questions first, right?
Yes, I wanted to do the poll questions first, but it turns out that I can't create polls in a running Zoom call.
Oh,
so,
yeah, that's
yeah. So you have to create the questions beforehand.
Yeah.
Which means that we can ask people to just answer in the chat, I think.
Yeah. So then maybe I should just share start by sharing the slides,
yeah.
because the poll questions is one of the first ones. Let me see if that's
Okay. I'm off. Enjoy your workshop.
Thank you.
It's not my area, so it will mean nothing to me. Bye-bye.
Bye.
right. So let me see if I. Yeah, I hope you are seeing the slides now.
I'm definitely seeing slides. I also see that we're being recorded. I'm not 100% sure if we want that. And if it makes sense.
I don't know if we can stop it. But,
I can definitely stop it.
Yeah, you're a host.
Yeah. So I'll just stop it. I don't think it makes much sense to record an empty main room while people are in the breakout rooms.
No.
Okay.